And welcome back, you guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hakeman. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in. As always, if you are enjoying these episodes, if you are learning a lot and feeling like you're getting value out of this, I will say I do 4 bonus episodes on Patreon every single month. And if you sign up, like if you were to join tier 3, which is where you can get the bonus episodes, if you were to sign up, you get access to all of the bonus episodes. It's not like it just starts like the month you sign up. You can go back through. So if that's something that interests you, check the show notes in the description. Tier 3, that is where I get into a lot of the nitty gritty and the comparisons. Like I think the last one I just did this week, I compared my 23 off season compared to my 24. And I went through like the measurements and more specifically, like why I felt like 24 was that much more successful, which I did just record a short form on this. So 18 things I did differently. Yes, 18 sounds excessive. It probably is, but these are the most important things, the things that really made the biggest difference, I felt, in my progress in 23 versus 24. So all that being said, what are we talking about today? Something that I think a lot of you are probably familiar with. It's definitely not new information, but I want to, once again, I want to get granular with something that might seem fundamental that I think a lot of people overthink. I think a lot of people get wrong, and ultimately this in itself can set you up on a trajectory in a fat loss phase, to honestly feel a little frustrated, to feel a little disappointed in the results. And that's what all the content I put out essentially is. It's to help you get more out of what you're doing. So today we are covering one of the most common questions that I get asked: how many calories should I eat a day? And truth be told, there's not a single magic number. But today I am going to give you really more of a framework to help you figure this out for yourself based on your goals, based on what you're willing to do, what you're able to do. And hopefully from this, because I know a handful of you guys are self-coached, and even those who aren't self-coached, even if you're just like, hey, like I am working with a coach and I don't know where they got these numbers from. I don't know if this is even in the ballpark of where I should be. Use this as a reference guide. Use this as a, reference point is the correct English way to say that. Use this as a reference, period. And hopefully, if you are wildly off, you can take what we're going to lay out here, put it into action, and then get a better sense of where you should actually be if you're looking to lose body fat. And I guess I've already misspoken, because the number one thing that's going to determine what you should be eating, how much you should be eating, is your goal. And I want you to think about this really simplistically. You're either trying to lose body fat or you're trying to gain muscle. And yes, there are people that are like, well, can't I do both at the same time? I'll level with you. It's very far and few that are going to actually be able to recomp, which I do have a guide coming out on that, not an actual like ebook or anything like that, but a body recomp guide episode where I'm going to go through what that actually looks like if you're recomping. But to be very clear here, this is going to be for select people, and it's going to come with a lot of conditions. And for simplicity, I really would say, like, if you're trying to make significant changes in your physique, you're going to, I would say, better spend your time picking a goal, committing to it, seeing it out, and then determining whether or not you should do the opposite. Whether if you lose body fat and you're like, yeah, you know what, I'm at my leanest and it's still not how I want to look. Okay, cool. Now this might mean that you need to build. And if you're building and you're like, okay, like, cool, I think I have the right amount of muscle now, I think I have more shape and like curves to my physique, maybe at this point it does make sense to lose body fat. So largely when we talk about calories, the first question really has to be, what is your goal? Do you want to lose fat? Do you want to build muscle? And maybe you want to do a little bit of both, but your goal is ultimately going to determine if you need to eat in a deficit or if you need to eat in a surplus. And if you're in a deficit, you will lose fat. Like, by definition, if you are eating less than you're burning. And I think it's important to really distill it down to just the simplicity of, like, from an energy availability standpoint, if you are eating less than you're burning, we should see body weight and body fat go down. And if you are eating in a surplus, which you absolutely should be doing if you are trying to gain muscle, this is going to result in scale weight going up. And yes, some body fat may come on during this process. This isn't abnormal. This isn't atypical. This is something that should be expected. But if you haven't checked out the video that I have, 3 signs that you are gaining fat and not muscle, I definitely recommend it, because those are 3 key things that I feel like can save you a lot of frustration and a lot of time. And I think truly when it comes down to it, I think being very specific with, do you need to lose body fat, and is just losing body fat going to be the thing that gets you to where you want to be? Or is this going to require multiple phases of fat loss, build, fat loss, build? And if so, I would first look at okay, if your body fat is too high, then maybe it would be beneficial to bring body fat a little bit lower. It doesn't mean you have to get show lean. It doesn't mean you have to get shredded, but just giving yourself more runway before that build. I found that to be so helpful with myself and with clients. So let's go with the obvious. If you're trying to lose body fat, you then have to choose the pace at which you want to lose. And this is what I refer to as the rate of loss or the rate of change. And this is essentially depicting the change that you see week to week. Now, do you want a slower or a faster rate of change? Now, a slower rate of change, it doesn't mean that progress is crawling. It just means that this is going to require less of a deficit than, on the other hand, if you want a faster rate of change, it's going to require a greater deficit. So let me say this. The range that I operate in is half a pound, which is a pretty conservative deficit. That's a 250 calorie deficit a day, versus 1.5 pounds a week, which would then require a 750 calorie deficit a day. Now, when we look at this spectrum and these constraints, could you go under 250 calories a day in terms of your deficit, or could you go over 750? Yes, absolutely. But really your skill set in terms of your ability to withstand deficit in a diet is going to determine where we should establish your rate of loss, like what that should be. Now, I think a lot of people are going to hear this and be like, I want to lose 1.5 pounds a week. Yeah, sign me up. And I understand it. It's very appealing to be like, okay, I'm going to see that big of a change every single week. Amazing. What you have to consider is that the greater deficit that you're in per day, the less sustainable this is in the long run. And if we're talking about someone who's trying to lose 10 pounds, 15 pounds, 20 pounds, it might not be advantageous to set the deficit so high if the amount of time that you need to diet is pretty lengthy. Now, before setting your calories, we need to establish basal metabolic rate. So this is your BMR. This is the amount of calories that your body needs just to exist. So even if you're lying down all day, you are sick, you're not doing anything, you're literally not moving. This is the amount that it costs in terms of calories, so units of energy that it's going to cost for you to just be alive. And the 2 biggest things influencing BMR, fat-free mass, so muscle mass, and your fat mass, so stored body fat. And the more muscle that you have, generally the higher BMR, because muscle tissue burns more calories than fat. So think about it this way. If you have someone who's 120 pounds and you take someone who has a high degree of muscle mass versus someone who has less muscle mass, but they're the same weight, the person that has more muscle mass, it is going to cause them to burn more calories just existing. And this is one of the reasons that I think a lot of people, they get hung up on specific numbers and they're like, well, I can't really lose weight unless I go under this threshold, or after this threshold, I tend to gain weight. One of the best ways to kind of hack the system is if you have more muscle, you're going to be able to get away with eating more because it's going to be more costly just for you to exist. So something that I like to do, and this is just generally to give you a ballpark of where you might sit in terms of your BMR. I like to take someone's weight and multiply it either by 10, 12, or 15. Now, realistically, for most women, I stick more to the 10 to 12 range. And the less muscle you have, I'm going to err on the side of that lower multiplier. So in some cases, even looking at 8 or 9. Now, if you're 120 pounds and you use this range to essentially determine, okay, here's roughly what my BMR is, I mean, you're looking at 1,200 to a little under 1,500 calories as your BMR. So the amount of calories you're burning every day. But remember, this is just an estimate. And body composition, yes, it generally influences your caloric burn, but past getting, a good sense of where you fall, we really have to look at what happens when you eat a certain amount of calories, and does this result in weight loss, in weight maintenance, or weight gain? Now, as a rule, if you're heavier, you're going to need more calories just to survive. And this means that your BMR is going to rise naturally as your body weight goes up, which means we can accept the fact that as body weight goes down, so in the case that you're losing 20, 30 pounds, there's going to be some drop off in the amount of calories that you burn specific to your basal metabolic rate. Now, next, we have to consider your daily activity. So outside of formal workouts, and this is something that is typically referred to as NEAT, so non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Now, some people, I know a girl is like super active, very fidgety, like even throughout her workouts in between sets, she's always dancing and like jumping around and just moving a ton. Now, you also have the other end of the spectrum where like you don't move that much and you aren't very fidgety. And this is something that we have to respect, that like NEAT is going to vary dramatically between individuals and is frequently underestimated. So as much as we might want to like establish, be like, well, I'm a super fidgety person, so I therefore should eat more food, it still is going to come back down to, once we put you at a certain intake, what happens once you follow that intake? Do you lose, do you gain, or do you maintain? Because remember, by definition, if you're in a deficit, you will lose weight. And if you're in a surplus, you will gain weight. Now, whenever working with a client for the first time, personally, I like to underestimate, because realistically, if we overestimate, well, then we've just wasted those first few weeks of a fat loss phase. And remember, I've talked about this before. Dietary fatigue is going to accrue whether or not you lose weight, whether or not you lose 0.5 pound or 1.5 pounds. If you are not seeing progress on the scale, and if you're not seeing it in body compositional changes, it's going to be harder to establish buy-in to the program, which is realistically why I'd rather have someone start a little bit lower, even if that means within the first few weeks of dieting, we see really quick progress. Maybe progress is a little too quick. From there, we can then increase food. So another aspect that I want you to think about is step count. So this is not the traditional sense like, okay, just fidgeting, but it is non-stimulating exercise. It's not exercise or cardio in the structured sense. It's not intentional steps that you're taking throughout the day. It's just steps that you naturally incur. And I know this gets a little muddy because some people are like, well, I walk my dog, and like if I didn't have a dog, I would still take these walks every single day. Like, when does this become structured or intentional versus unintentional? Really, it just comes down to, on average, how much are you moving outside of your workouts and outside of structured machine cardio? I've worked with clients who truly, like, without trying, without being intentional, they get in 15 to 20,000 steps a day. And for them, we have to be really cognizant that we're considering this when establishing their deficit. And realistically, this could be compounded as a form of non-exercise activity. And as a coach, it's really important to know the intentionality behind someone's non-exercise activity and whether or not that's something that's likely going to persist even as they enter into a deficit. Now, on the other hand, I've had clients who aren't necessarily busy and are very sedentary. Maybe they work remotely and also are in school, so they spend a lot of time studying or reading. And because of that, their step count, maybe they don't have pets or don't have kids, their step count is very low. And it's something that can be very eye-opening if you've never tracked. And it's not something that I necessarily think like you have to have an Apple Watch or you have to have a Whoop or a Wise Watch, but you can, if you have an iPhone, you can just look at your phone and see like, okay, how much activity am I getting per day? And this is something that I think for a lot of people, unintentionally, they're probably going to get somewhere between 4,000 to 6,000 steps. But in the case that someone is much lower than this, if someone's struggling to get in 3,000 or 4,000 steps a day, if that's something they have to be intentional about, this needs to be factored into determining their starting calories when going into a fat loss phase. And by proxy, we can also modulate step count if they have the schedule that allows for them to get in more steps a day, and if it's not a hassle for them based on their other responsibilities. If, let's say, someone isn't able to get in a lot of structured cardio, but they do have the ability to go on walks before and after every meal or first thing in the morning. Maybe they do have an animal and they're like, yeah, you know what? I can add an extra 5 minutes to these walks that I'm already going to be taking. Now, the next thing that we have to consider is workout intensity. So let's consider structure exercise training, so weightlifting. How hard does someone actually train? I've spoken with a lot of people. We'll get on these 15-minute consultation calls to give them more information about my coaching service. And throughout this, one of the questions I do ask is, what's your training like? How hard do you train? How comfortable are you with gauging intensity? And sure, this is something that subjectively someone might be able to depict pretty accurately, but footage is something that I personally find really helpful as a coach. So I have all my clients send me roughly 3 to 5 training videos a week so that I can observe, yes, intensity, technical execution, of course, safety, but largely I'm wanting to get an idea of whether or not they're training as intensely as I need them to, or whether they're a little bit shy of this. Now, something that I've talked about before in a different solo episode is training terminology, and more specifically intensity and what this actually looks like. So if you haven't checked out that episode, I definitely recommend it. But when we're looking at intensity, this is going to be defined as proximity to failure. And this not only is important in gauging where someone should start a fat loss phase from, but it's also important in understanding what is the likelihood that they're still going to be burning calories through the recovery process in between sessions. Realistically, someone who's training very hard, consistently close to failure, they're going to burn more calories and they're going to recover differently from someone who's not training nearly as intensely or as consistently. And this across the board will absolutely influence calorie targets and the kind of deficit that we need to create through other means. Now, for a lot of people, what we have to assume, or what we should assume, is that you're not going to burn that much in your training sessions. So, realistically, if you're in the gym, maybe an hour, 2 hours, this isn't going to make up a bulk of your deficit. And frankly, I don't want someone in the gym weightlifting 6 to 7 times a week, because that's not going to allow them to reach that proximity to failure that I'm after. Now, with all this in mind, for most women I coach who want to lose weight, I typically suggest calories in more of a moderate range. And for most people, it's going to fall somewhere between 1,200 and 1,600 calories daily. And I'm sure some of you are like, why not lower? If you have someone who's a little more sedentary, if you have someone who doesn't have the time to do as much cardio, can we go under 1,200 calories? And what I'll say is that in my experience, anything significantly below 1,200 becomes very difficult to sustain for most people. And for most people, they're not going to really feel satisfied. And this is particularly true if someone really struggles with adherence and satiation. But on top of that, that's going to make it that much more difficult to recover from their workouts and maintain just an overall baseline in terms of mental well-being. Now, realistically, why not higher? Because trust me, I've had clients come to me who I've taken them from 2,000 calories down to 1,600 or even 1,400. And they've pitched a fit because they're like, why are you trying to starve me? I'm not going to be able to recover off of this. And realistically, what I have to say is there aren't many people who are going to lose off of 1,600 calories. It's not to say, 100% of the time across the board. I'm sure there's some people that maybe you're listening to this and you feel a little pissed because you're like, my metabolism's on fire. I maintain off 2,000 calories. And realistically, that might apply for you. Maybe you do need more than 1,600 calories. But what I've found is that when you start someone on a fat loss phase, if their goal is to lose fat, we need to actually see that translated to scale weight and body composition, because the thing that's going to hinder buy-in is that first or second week not seeing progress on the scale. And I can't tell you how many times I've had someone make the argument I don't want to slow my metabolism. I don't want to starve myself. I don't want to get skinny. Okay, yes, absolutely. But we need to make sure that you're in a big enough deficit. And for me, for most people, I like to have them in a 500 calorie deficit a day, unless for some other reason they are looking to lose at a slower rate of loss, so less than 1 pound a week. With that being said, there's nothing wrong with setting the deficit for 300 calories a day or 400 calories a day. But I would definitely caution you from starting a fat loss phase if you're not actually able to commit to losing body fat. And realistically, if the goal is fat loss, but you know this is just a short sprint, it's very temporary, I would honestly encourage you to challenge yourself. Try to get into that 500 calorie deficit a day, either through both diet and cardio or some combination of both. Because if you're only trying to lose 5 pounds, it's like if you were to lose this in 5 to 6 weeks, so roughly 1 pound lost per week. Then once the fat's gone, you can then focus on whatever other goals you might have. So if that is building, great, you've been really efficient with the fat loss phase, you haven't drawn it out unnecessarily. So when we look at using body weight to establish generally this idea, it can be a little discouraging, especially if you're someone who doesn't want to go under 1,500 calories, but someone who's 150 pounds. That range, that BMR could very well be between 15 and 1,800 calories. And sure, if you're super dense, maybe you can lose off 18 or 19. But I'll tell you, in my experience, that rarely happens. And even if someone's able to lose, it's typically not at a rate that's satisfying for them. All in all, we're taking women in the weight range from 100 to 150 pounds. And it's there's this 600 calorie difference in basal metabolic rate on average, 1,200 to 1,800. So if I have a female come to me who's 120 pounds or even lighter, and she's insistent, I don't want to go under 1,600 calories, realistically, she's going to have to do a lot to make sure that she's generating that deficit through output, which all in all, I think can be problematic and cannot be very sustainable for most people. So I want you to kind of visualize this. You have your BMR, and you can establish generally you're somewhere in between this range on average. And if you're like me, you're going to be more conservative and assume that you're kind of on the lower range, because even very dense individuals, there are fluctuations with energy that they spend each and every day. So there can be variations in step count and how much they're fidgeting and how hard they're training. And realistically, we want to create as much continuity. So going with the amount that's lower at least saves you from then having to continue to reduce calories even after you made probably a pretty significant drop in that first week of fat loss. So once we have this baseline of BMR, from here we can factor in step count, and we can be okay, maybe there's 100 to 200 calorie buffer. And for those who are super active, maybe it's even more than that. But what about structured cardio? Now, structured cardio, when I use this term, I'm referring to cardio on a machine. I'm referring to cardio probably with the heart rate somewhere between 120 and 150 beats per minute. And yes, cardio that is going to burn more calories, yes, it's going to result in a greater deficit, but it can also be costly. And it can also be something that over the grand scheme of your fat loss phase, it can then hinder training performance, which is how we're going to best keep muscle on. It can also drive up hunger signaling. So we want to make sure not to overbid or overcommit ourselves to these high intensity forms of cardio, not necessarily high intensity interval training, but forms of cardio that are very systemically fatiguing. So at the time that you're listening to this, I'll have already released an episode specifically talking about cardio mistakes that can absolutely impact your fat loss progress. And I go into the details around modalities, durations, and when to time your cardio. And it's not to say that anything that I cover is, if it's not preferential, that it's necessarily bad. It's just to say that there are times that are more favorable than others, depending on what your goal is and depending on what your schedule and recovery capacity allow for. Now, when it comes to structured cardio, there are two sides of the coin. There's the individual that wants to do a lot, and then there's the individual that wants to do none. Now, I think that it's important to find this harmonious balance between implementing some degree of structured cardio to increase that deficit so that it's not entirely coming from diet, while also respecting the fact that there are costs to doing too much cardio. Overall, systemic fatigue, that is going to build. And this is what I'm talking about when I refer to runaway within a fat loss phase. We need to make sure that depending on how much weight you want to lose and the rate of loss that you're aiming for, that you have the faculty and the drive to get through that fat loss phase. Because realistically, I think a lot of people, if they knew hey, I can do this in a very extreme sense and I can lose weight very quickly, but it's probably going to result in me spiraling and regaining some of the weight back almost immediately, they would probably opt out of that kind of format of a fat loss phase. Whereas what I would prefer someone to do is consider how much weight they want to lose, set the rate of loss to something that is modest but still aggressive enough to keep them on plan, while also considering, is this something that realistically they can sustain for the total duration of fat loss that they'd like to pursue? And this is exactly why we don't just endlessly increase cardio. We should be generally strategic with it to complement the caloric goals without sabotaging recovery. Now, I can tell you, yes, like we've talked about general ranges, and when you look at different forms of cardio, I mean, you look at like the most intense like forms of running or even Stairmaster, that realistically, if you do that for an hour, you're going to burn about 500 calories per session. And that might sound really favorable, but is that something you're going to be able to do 7 days a week? Probably not. And if you are, it's probably not going to be for the total duration in which you're trying to pursue fat loss. So this is where I would rather use a little bit more of an aggressive approach out the gate when someone's at a higher body fat, given that systemically they're going to be able to recover from higher deficits early on into a diet, as opposed to when you look at someone who's leaner, who has less recovery capacity, who's already been dieting for a sustained period of time, they're going to be less able to recover from these 750, 1,000 calorie, 1,250 calorie deficits a day. And that's really where we have to consider when we're talking about the rate of loss, what's the likelihood in them losing muscle, or frankly, just being ready to be done with the diet. I think for most people, whether we're talking about a build or fat loss phase, we want to end whatever phase it is on a positive note. We don't want to end where someone's like, I hate dieting. I resent it. Every time I do it, it becomes this whole hassle. And then within the first week after a diet, I just end up gaining several pounds back. If that's how you're ending a fat loss phase, it probably was too aggressive, or it probably was executed in a way that isn't sustainable. And yeah, in practice, it might be appealing to be in 1,000 calorie deficit a day or a 750 calorie deficit a day, but you have to look at the application. What happens in real time? And after settling into that initial caloric deficit and activity recommendations, are you actually able to stick to it? Because I've had people come to me who are like, hey, like, I'll just do whatever you tell me to. Like, I am very tough mentally. I'm very robust. I'm very anti-fragile. And it doesn't really matter how little food I get. But these are also the same people that I tend to see once we get a little more aggressive, they begin to struggle and stumble through that fat loss phase. And what does this actually look like? Well, a very objective way is low adherence or even poor adherence. And I've have tons of episodes on adherence. So if that's something you're interested in hearing, definitely go check those out. But adherence is your ability to adhere and follow and commit to the program. And as much as I've been in this position before where I'm like, I'll shed 10 pounds in 6 weeks or 8 weeks. It's like, there are things that are going to impede your ability to be adherent. And some, yes, within your control, some not. And I think going into a diet, and especially if you're working with a coach, and I guess even if you're self-coaching, being really honest about what your level of adherence is at this moment and what it likely is going to be over the next 6 to 8, 12 weeks, depending on how long you're going to diet for. So I'll tell you a story. In December of 24, I finished my build. I put on 4 inches on my glutes and it was remarkable. And yes, I got to a body fat that I was really uncomfortable with. And even though it wasn't necessarily sloppy, it isn't representative of how I want my physique to look majority of the time. And yes, I'm happy with the build. I'm happy with the muscularity that I put on. But at that point, I was really ready to begin to trim down. The problem was, I had a lot of travel coming up, and not just travel, I had a lot of social events, and even more so, I had a lot of personal stress. I had a slew of my own health issues. I had family issues that were very draining and things that were unexpected and very much could not be ignored. So I went into December and January knowing that, it's the holiday season and I'm gonna want to partake in a lot of these social events, a lot of these gatherings. And realistically, I was like, well, I'm not in a position where I can really commit to losing body fat, but I also don't want to gain. So I'm going to find a happy medium where maybe I am just eating at maintenance, or maybe I am eating in a deficit, knowing that the days that I'm going to these social events, I'm also going to be in a surplus, creating this net wash for the weekly average in terms of caloric intake. And I think it can be frustrating for a lot of people when they're like, well, no, if I just force it, if I just force myself to restrict, if I just force myself to lose weight, well, then everything will be fine. But realistically, if there are things that are making fat loss harder, it very much could be in your favor to decide to maintain or even just be very realistic with what you can expect in terms of fat loss, given that adherence is not going to be as high. It wasn't until travel stopped, and I'm going to say, like, honestly, until mid-February that things kind of slowed down, that I was able to really dig my heels into the ground and be like, okay, I am committing to fat loss. Like, I'm going to minimize these untracked meals. I'm going to minimize these overages because I'm going to exponentially increase my adherence so that I know for a fact I'm in the deficit that I want to create. And through that, I've been able to see very consistent fat loss even early on into a diet. Now, I'll tell you another story. I had a client who came to me who is in school, married, really focused on developing her business and putting a lot of time into her clients. And she came to me wanting to lose fat, but she was also very realistic. She's like, I know that my stress is high right now. I know that I have control over most of my food decisions, but I'm really not able to segment out more time to cardio. And I know that hunger signaling is a little dysregulated given stress is so high. And as much as she wanted to lose that 1 pound per week, she's like, you know what? I think that if I go into this expecting to lose it 1 pound per week, that kind of deficit is going to be too hefty for me to follow. Instead, can we hit something that's a little bit more modest, so a 250 calorie deficit? And if it's something that I can commit more to, we can escalate it. But realistically, this is something that I know I can be successful with. And I love this because that level of self-awareness set her up for success. And it also gave me really good insight into where she was at from an adherence standpoint. And yes, she was able to make really good progress and continue to lose fat. And even though it didn't happen at the rate that initially she wanted, I think it was the fact that we were able to string together so many successful weeks in a row where she was seeing the scale go down 0.5 pound or 0.7 pounds that ultimately led her to feeling better about the phase itself, as opposed to prior fat loss phases where it was just very bro-y and very restrictive. And she felt like no matter how hard she tried and how best she tried to be adherent, she was always failing. But the question I want you to ask yourself when given that set amount is, can you realistically stick to this? And how much willpower are you going to have to execute on a daily basis in order to be successful? Because realistically, the diet that's going to work best for you is the one that you can stick to. And even if that's at a slower rate of loss than you initially wanted, it still might be collectively more successful than, let's say, if you try to dig yourself into that 750 or 1,000 calorie deficit, knowing that yeah, you might be on track for 2-3 days, but by day 4, you're going to be so stressed out and hunger is going to be through the roof and you're really going to want to go off track. At the end of the day, that's not successful. And also to that point, if after a diet, if you are just looking forward to the diet ending and getting to eat that much more food, like to an extent that you're like, okay, I'm ready to be done with this because I never want to track again. I don't want to follow anything rigid. I don't want to follow something that's like set in stone. That's probably an indication that the deficit is too great. And listen, even the best designed plans won't work if you can't follow it consistently. So this is where I think it's important to stay flexible and listen to your body and specifically your hunger signaling, because yes, we do expect these things to downregulate, and specifically hunger, we expect that to go up in a fat loss phase. But I like to approach this more so if we can catch non-adherence before it's in the red, so yellow, orange, red, if we can catch it when it's starting to get a little rocky and then correct, that ultimately is going to lead to better outcomes versus if every time that you feel overly restrictive or overly dieted, you just go off the rails and binge and overeat to an extent that it then shows up in your check-in photos or on your scale weight. I think it's important that if adherence is becoming a struggle, if you are not able able to consistently follow the plan that you communicate with your coach. And if you're self-coached, this is a really good practice, is to journal and to be very honest with like, hey, like, yes, I want this thing, but right now the challenge is I can't stick to really the requirements that it takes to achieve this thing. And it might come down to continuing to develop the skill of dieting, which I've said 1,000 times at this point. It is a skill and it's something that you can get better at. And just because you're starting out and you're like, yo, like a 500 calorie deficit sounds so aggressive, don't let that intimidate you. There are definitely hacks. There are definitely ways to make this easier. And remember, like, you don't get points for suffering. Yes, it's kind of glamorized in the fitness space and bodybuilding space to be in these super extreme and great deficits. And realistically, I don't think that exposing yourself to these extremes unnecessarily is really helping you develop that skill. And yes, like what I'm saying, everything I've covered, it might not always match textbook recommendations or what you find in application, but if you're consistent and you're in a deficit, you will lose weight, because by definition, you will lose weight if you are in a caloric deficit. So what I would do is, if you're trying to figure out how many calories you should start at for your fat loss phase, I would set your goal very clearly. Do you want to lose? And if you do want to lose, how quickly do you want to lose? And realistically, what is the kind of deficit that you can stick to? I would get an idea of your BMR, and you don't have to use some fancy calculation. Just take your body weight and multiply it by 10 or 12. And depending on how dense you are and how active you are and really what you've seen trend in your metabolism historically, this could be an opportunity to play with different ranges and get a better understanding of what the response actually is to different caloric amounts. I would adjust for real life activity levels. So if you are going into a really busy season where you're going to be on your feet a lot and moving a lot, this could allow you a little more leeway calorically. I would also factor in training intensity, and I would use structured cardio strategically without overdoing it. Finally, prioritize adherence. Adherence is going to trump all, and consistency above all else. So if what you can be consistent to right now isn't ideal, that's okay. You can still take steps in the right direction, and steps forward are certainly better than steps forward only to account for as many steps, if not more, backwards. You guys, thank you so much for joining me today. And if this helped clarify how many calories you should eat, definitely let me know in the comments below. If it didn't, also let me know in the comments below. If you found this annoying because I wasn't more specific, please tell me. If you have any questions, comments, topics, or any additions you want to add to any of the points I made, let me know. Send me a message, shoot me an email. I do offer one-on-one coaching and one-on-one consultations. I'd love to hear from you. And until next time, as always, I will see you in the next one.